Hello friends, welcome to the M.A.R.E podcast. Before we get started, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Don't forget that you can find more about the M.A.R.E project at www.marehamburg.com, and you can support the project and this podcast through Patreon. All the links are in the description. Enjoy!
Hello friends, welcome to another episode of the M.A.R.E podcast. It is my great pleasure to welcome Brenna Thornley tonight into the podcast. Hello Brenna, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. So let's get straight to the point. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Absolutely, yes. So I have just completed my master's degree in global maritime archaeology at the University of Malta. To give you a little bit of background about myself, I actually came in a non-traditional route. So I didn't study archaeology, history, anything in my undergraduate program, but I actually rather came from the sea. So I was working as a professional seafarer. I was driving boats over in Hawaii and also in the Pacific Northwest. And throughout that time, I decided I wanted to kind of take a different approach to the maritime cultural landscape. And I discovered the University of Malta and the program that I went to. And before I knew it, I actually ended up there and got to do the wonderful program and experience the sea from a different perspective. And I ended up really enjoying it. So,
Wow, interesting, very interesting. So a seafarer, you're driving boats in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Wow, can you tell me a bit about that? I'm actually curious.
Absolutely, yes. That was kind of how I started. So I was always obsessed with the ocean. When I was 7 years old, my mom bought me a sweater that said I'm a dolphin stuck in a human's body. And one day I went over there and I got to experience some of the different encounters that you can have with wildlife, and I just fell in love. So I ended up driving boats for a long time and working on boats, working with the manta rays that you can swim with over there, dolphins, sharks, a lot of different wildlife that I encountered. So that kind of escalated into getting my captain's license, and I started working on private yachts and various different boats, and I ended up just really enjoying that mariner lifestyle, and I decided to maybe look at it and kind of learn from the people that came before me and how it worked with them.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I mean, wait, so how did it happen that you discovered Malta out of all places? Why Malta?
This is actually one of life's most beautiful full circle moments. So I had a really tough year. I lost a friend to the sea, and I ended up deciding to move back home, back to the mainland, and pursue kind of a slower life. And on my flight, this is a true story. On my flight home, I had downloaded a podcast that was just called Shipwrecks. I knew nothing about it, and it was an interview of a student from the University of Malta who was in the program. And the moment I heard that, I knew that I wanted to do it. And within 6 months, I moved to Malta.
Wow. Wow. That's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary story. Oh my God. We are off to a great start. Okay. But let's get to what you've done then. Then I want to know more, and then I can ask you more questions. Okay, let's jump to the research. Let's get that out of the way.
Okay.
So you just defended your thesis, as you taught me, at the University of Malta. So what was the thesis about?
Absolutely, yes. So my thesis was about maritime memorialization. What I wanted to look at was how the death of seafarers interacted with coastal communities, how they impacted it, both within a landscape of separation. So if a seafarer died far away from home, how was that memorialization treated, as well as in general, how a coastal community could be impacted by the death of a sailor. And I focused specifically on a case study over in Malta, the case study of Thomas McSweeney, and it was supplemented by 3 other case studies. However, the case study of Thomas McSweeney took some big turns, and it ended up becoming a larger story than I anticipated. So it was the main focus of my dissertation.
Nice. Okay, so tell us more about it then. I want to know, how do people react then to death of sailors?
Absolutely. Definitely, there's all sorts of different ways. Unfortunately, a lot of seafarers that pass away at sea don't get a proper memorial back at home. Sometimes there's empty graves. Other times their bodies are able to be brought back to land. So that is actually the perception during the Age of Sail, was that it was ideal to be buried on land. So a lot of times they would be buried in foreign countries because it would just be the closest place. However, most often it was kind of common practice for a death at sea burial. But that was kind of seen in two different ways. Primarily, it was seen as more of a negative thing, that those seafarers weren't going to be able to rest peacefully. So the ideal logic was to bury them on land, and that's how McSweeney ended up where he was. If you want to get into it, but it's a little bit of a gray point.
Okay, wait, the Age of Sail. What is
Yes.
the Age of Sail, and when is the Age of Sail?
Yeah, yes. So the Age of Sail, I define it within my research as roughly the beginning of the 15th century through the turn of the 20th. That's because that's about the time that the global expansion began. It really became a prominent fixture within our global landscape, and at the turn of the 20th century, steam became a little bit more prominent, and sail started to make its way out of the technological kind of landscape that we have now.
Okay, let's talk about, let's focus a bit on McSweeney. Is McSweeney?
Yeah, Thomas
Okay.
McSweeney. Yep.
Noel McSweeney. So what's his story? What's about him?
Absolutely. So Thomas McSweeney, he was a Catholic Irish seafarer. He was born in the early 19th century, and he enlisted as a British Royal Marine and was assigned on board the HMS Rodney in 1835. At this point, he was under the command of Lance Sergeant James T. Allen, this is important, a Protestant Englishman. So for over the course of about a year and a half, while they were on tour, while they were on the HMS Rodney together, they had kind of a history of strife and an incompatible relationship, you can say. And about a year and a half later, while they were docked in Barcelona, they got into a bit of an altercation. So there was a lot of history reported that they never got along. And at this point, it's said that Allen, being McSweeney's commanding officer, set him up to get in trouble. So Allen told McSweeney that he had the evening off, and McSweeney was asleep in his hammock. And Allen, then a few hours later, came to get McSweeney, threatened a court martial because he failed to show up to work. And at this point, they're arguing. They go up to the waist of the ship, up and then onto the dock. And at this point, it escalates more. And McSweeney actually pushes Allen from the gangway of the ship into the waist. So the gangway is the little, at this point, most likely a wooden plank that's you're going to walk from the dock to the boat onto. And the waist is going to be the inside of the ship, right? So McSweeney is going to fall, or excuse me, McSweeney pushes Allen. Allen falls just about 2 meters into it, but he succumbs to some very serious concussion. It's described at this point as a violent concussion. And there's no such thing as manslaughter at this point. And McSweeney is taken away with the court martial, and he is going to be charged with murder. So Allen has passed away. He received a sea burial. Why? I'm not 100% sure, as he was docked within Barcelona, but we do know that his remains were taken to the sea, and McSweeney was taken on board a different ship, and that was just so happened to be headed to Malta.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow. A lot of vendetta and violence, but I guess
it's gonna get worse.
Oh, it's gonna get worse. Well,
yes.
Please continue. Go ahead.
So at this point, McSweeney, this is August 1836. In February 1837, McSweeney gets a 3-day court martial. In between, he was kept in isolation, so he didn't see any sunlight. He had 2 visitors, 2 Maltese priests. That's it. He was said to have lost about 70% of his body weight at this point, and he was very frail and not doing super well. But he got the 3-day court martial. At this point, he was not defended, or he was not assigned any sort of defense lawyer, prosecutor. It was just some testimonies back and forth. Various people had completely different and contrasting accounts, and at the end of it, McSweeney was sentenced to death by hanging off the yard arm of the HMS Rodney. So the yard arm is going to be one of the tall masts of the ship, and McSweeney was actually taken from the ship that he had been held in isolation on, and they wanted to bring him back and execute him on board the ship that he had been serving on.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what happened?
So flash forward another 4 months. So at this point, McSweeney is being held in isolation from August to June. So in June of 1837, the Royal Navy ordered from reports 12 of its Mediterranean fleet to come and watch. So 12 of the Mediterranean fleets came over to the Malta's Grand Harbor, and they all lined up, and the HMS Rodney was on full display. McSweeney was taken from the ship he was held in isolation on with the black cover over his head, and he was taken to the Rodney. At this point, it's reported that anywhere from hundreds of thousands of Maltese onlookers gathered to watch, as this was also what was said to have been the only Mediterranean execution by the British Royal Navy outside of wartime ever. So it was a huge spectacle, and obviously the Maltese onlookers noticed, all these ships in and hearing of the execution. So they all gathered to watch, and at the turn of 6 a.m., they fired a gun and McSweeney was hung. There is speculation on how many people actually helped do the execution, but there is a few accounts from archival research that said that the Royal Navy actually pulled 2 people from each ship. So it could be anywhere up to 26 men that pulled the rope to execute him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So then he's executed, and is he buried in Malta now or not?
Yes. So that is kind of where his connection to Malta began. So as far as I am aware, as far as all of the archival documents, he actually never stepped foot onto Malta alive. But after about 30 minutes of being hung in the air, the 2 Maltese priests that visited him on a daily basis, which was his only outside contact with the world, were able to retrieve his body. Now, there is speculation because at this point in history, most convicted criminals in Malta were buried at the Blotta Il Baida cemetery in mass unmarked graves. However, McSweeney does actually have a very prominent monument at a different cemetery. It's called the St. Lawrence Cemetery. So regardless of whether his physical remains are there or not, that was kind of the focal point of my archaeological survey, was this monument that he has.
Okay, but obviously, why? Why did he get a monument?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. So at the time, I would like to understand that. So that was actually what I was looking at, was why does he have a monument? What was so significant about him? And more than anything is, when you go to visit any day, you could fly there tomorrow. There will be lit candles at his grave, and there will be fresh flowers. And that was kind of the turning point of, okay, so we've got this story, this executed, criminal, who kind of had some similarities with Malta. So this is kind of where the hypothesis and the conclusions began, is, okay, so we've got an Irish Catholic seafarer, has some strife with Protestant Englishmen. And at this point, Malta has a very, very heavy Catholic influence, and it is also under British imperial rule. So it had some similarities. And it's kind of believed that they took some pity on McSweeney because at this point he's only 21 years old. So he was a very young guy, made a mistake, is a lot of the public perception of that, and that he was unjustly and unfairly punished due to his religious and nationality.
Okay. Interesting. But who paid for the monument?
That actually is one of my biggest quandaries, and unfortunately I have yet to be able to find that out. However, I do know that it was not the church that paid for it, so I'm assuming it must have been some of the onlookers. However, I do actually have sources that he has actually two plaques, and I'll get to the other one later, but the first one is original. It's been there since his execution, and it is his main maritime connection, is it lets everybody know that he was executed on the Rodney.
The other one?
Yes. The other one is new, actually. So the other one was installed somewhere between 2012 and 2024. And it's a kind of a focal point of my research as well as why. And also affixed to it is a photo meant to depict McSweeney. But at this point time, uh, photography was actually kind of started to become, the Daguerrean type started to become public at the same year of his execution. So it's very provable that it's not a photo of him, but it's rather a photo meant to depict him. And I will get into some of those reasons why later.
Okay. I mean, you can get into those reasons now if you want to.
Fantastic. Yes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to that's kind of where I started with looking at all of this evidence. So, I'm in front of this monument and there's fresh flowers, there's candles, and there's a new tombstone and there's just such an obvious community interaction that's active to this day, even though his execution was over 180 years ago. And I wanted to understand why this community did this. What about his story, what about him actually impacted them to the point where they cared so much. And it was it contrasted so much with the rest of the cemetery's landscape because all of the other 19th century material remains were excavated and just kind of laid upon the side of the cemetery. So if you do go to the cemetery, there's all of these beautiful old tombstones. However, they're not upkept at all. So a lot of them are illegible. A lot of them are just kind of in disarray and they're just on the landscape or on the walls of the cemetery. And so the cemetery is just a complete contrasting. So there's only one 19th century material evidence at all, and that is McSweeney's tombstone, his monument, and the rest are left in disarray and they're just kind of discarded upon the walls of the cemetery. That's because in the late 20th century, they did a bunch of modernization. They're actually using the cemetery now for active burials. So very, very noticeable. So with all of this visual evidence, archaeological evidence, I wanted to understand what was going on. So I was able to do that by kind of all three methodologies. So I mixed archaeology, and that's with all of what I was just explaining, the 19th century remains. I also did a very deep historical argument. So I looked into a varying vast accounts of archival resources. I was able to translate a lot of archaic and modern Maltese to kind of understand a little bit more insight. And then also I did an ethnographic study. So I was able to get approval to actually speak to some of the people. So everything kind of changed the day that I went to do some photogrammetry of the monument. And on my way out, I found a lovely woman who was carrying a candle. And given that it's an active cemetery, I didn't want to overstep my bounds or anything, but I did ask her if she knew anything about the old grave in the corner of the cemetery. And she told me that, of course she did. She was bringing the candle for him, and that she was there to pray for her niece to get pregnant. And that's where it took a turn. Yes.
What?
Yes. So now we're looking at, okay, we've started from his execution, and we've got a community held belief that what she explained to me was that there are people within Malta that believe that McSweeney is an unofficial Catholic saint that is able to grant miracles of fertility and health. And that it is common practice for, people struggling with fertility, whether it's themselves or family members, to go and focus their prayers on McSweeney's monument. And that she also said there's tangible evidence that this is a true story. And through our vast archival research and really deep diving into this, I was actually able to find some other sources that legitimize this belief and this community tradition. So
Wow. I am speechless. I am speechless, honestly. What?
So let me take you from point A to
Yeah, please. Go ahead. I am puzzled and speechless and confused right now. Yeah, continue.
Yes, that's exactly how I felt. So I looked at point A, I looked at point B, and I did my best to identify how we got there. So what I did was I defined them as trigger events. I defined them as kind of moments in time where the community may have been further impacted than normal within the story, right? Because as I said, McSweeney had no connection to Malta other than his execution. So that would be the first trigger event, his actual execution. As I kind of stated, it was a huge spectacle, but on the undertones, the Maltese community was actually facing a very, very devastating cholera epidemic at this point. So they were going through quite a high mortality rate. And even though that was occurring, they still all gathered, a lot of them gathered on the streets to watch this execution. So from my research, I was able to kind of argue that it was a stark contrast between, imperial authority and the planned and organization of his execution versus just the utter chaos and devastation that the community was facing, creating this just stark difference that would likely leave a very long impact on that community's memory.
Wow.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh my God. I
I got
have
more.
so questions. Go, please. Tell me more.
So my second trigger event that I identified was actually a lightning strike. So approximately a year and a half after the execution of Thomas McSweeney, the HMS Rodney was off the coast of Malta doing a training exercise with two different ships as well. And it's described as a bright, sunny day, no clouds in sight. And the HMS Rodney was said to have gotten struck by lightning. And this very Catholic, superstitious community viewed that as a bad omen, as divine power punishing the HMS Rodney for what they did to McSweeney. And at this point, a lithograph was actually circulating Malta that depicted the event and describing McSweeney's story and what had happened to him. So likely that kind of reinvigorated the interest within his story and kind of kept that superstition going. And at this point is when ghost stories started to arise about McSweeney and superstition. So throughout the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, we have very large ghost stories that have kind of circulated in the community. One of my favorites is, and I think it's just absolutely such an incredible story, is during the Second World War, Malta was heavily, heavily aerated, one of actually the most aerated places in the world. So we have a beautiful story of this woman from the Three Cities of Malta, which is with the region in which his cemetery is. The air raids were going off, the sirens, and they were warning her, to take cover, to go into a shelter. And she had just lost a few family members the day before to an air raid, and she described it as being kind of stuck in place. She was unable to move forward. She was unable to kind of get herself to go and do anything and respond. And at this point, she had a knock on her door, and this tall sailor actually was standing at her door and was motioning her to follow him. And she followed him, and he took her to safety. And she later recounts that that was the ghost of Thomas McSweeney.
Wow. Do you okay, quick question in between. Do you think it has an effect? Do you think it matters that Malta is an island and small island, and so a small community? So these kinds of stories and superstitions are maybe multiplied.
Absolutely. Yes. I do think that was, it's a big part of it. It's a small community. Things are going to circulate. And Malta is such a dynamic seafaring coastal community, right? There's just such an impact, and it has to be. It's an island completely segmented from anything. No natural water sources. They're on their own, and they have to rely on seafaring to survive. So I think that it is one of the most important aspects of Malta is its seafaring connection and its maritime connection. And, you know, in addition to the Catholic influences, I think it just was a prime location for a lot of superstition, a lot of varying beliefs that help the community. And as I can kind of explain, we started from a seafaring tradition, a seafaring tragedy, really, and it became something entirely different. So that was kind of the conclusion of my research was this community took this story and they made it into what they needed that served the needs of the community. And I think that is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole thing, was how this story impacted the community, but also how the community impacted the story.
That is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. But okay. So where do you plan on expanding upon your research? What do you plan on doing now? Do you want to publish it somewhere? What do you want to do with it?
Absolutely. Yes, I am so incredibly eager to publish this. I think it's got a lot more work to do as well. And whether that gets to be me or somebody else, I think that there's more to uncover. Unfortunately, my ethnographic studies didn't go quite as much as I hoped. So I was unable to conduct as many interviews. That is perfectly reasonable. I was very, very steadfast in being as ethical as possible. And a lot of opportunities I had to interview people just didn't feel right. I'm walking up in this active cemetery and there's people at McSweeney's grave, and very visibly they're taking a minute and they're having a moment with him, and it wasn't my place to interrupt that and try to get information. So I definitely had a little bit of a hard time navigating that, and I did have some very successful conversations, as you heard, but that there's a bigger reach than I expected. So one of the things about my research was I wanted to focus on coastal communities, so I segmented it into the 3 cities of Malta. However, throughout the research, I did learn that it reached all the way to Masta and Maliha, which is both. Masta is an inland city, so it's not connected to the coast quite as much. It's near the middle of Malta, and Maliha is almost as far away from McSweeney's monument as possible. So it reached significantly farther than I thought, and I think that there's a lot more we can still do. But
Okay. No, that's very interesting. So do people know the story, like the real story? Do they know the story? Or do they just not care about the story, like the actual story of who this person was?
that is a good question. So I'm gonna take a really long answer, and I'm sorry in advance, but this is kind of what I looked in as well, is what the current perception of McSweeney is. So I actually segmented it into 3 different beliefs. The first is the public media. So a lot of the popular media about him, which still circulates to this day. There's media publications from the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, and it's had a large spark and interest again. And the main focus is the story of his actual execution. So all of these media publications talk about what happened to him, and they highlight his Catholic and Irish origins, and kind of contrast it with the imperialism and the Protestantism that impacted him. And so that's what I defined as known beliefs, the defined ones, the ones we understand, the ones that are very visible in the public. Then I went into the divine beliefs, is what I called them, which is the fertility and the health miracles, those beliefs that he has kind of these divine powers and can impact this community in this way. And the last one is the unknown. So a few of my conversations and some archival resources actually indicated that it's become just a long family tradition for a lot of different families. So, I talked to some people and asked them, if you don't mind me asking what you're doing here, why are you giving these flowers? Why are you lighting these candles? And they would tell me they don't know, that it's something their great grandmother would do, and they have just been doing it their entire lives. And it's something every time they visit the cemetery, they bring a candle for him. So those 3 kind of beliefs, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think, they can kind of intertwine with one another as well.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. It's a beautiful way of explaining it. So, okay, kind of like last question is, what does that mean to you, given that you gave us a bit of your background and how you decided to pursue this master? So, what does this story mean to you, and why do you? Because you're clearly very passionate about it, and I think that's fantastic. But what does the story mean to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't want to get too emotional on you, but
No, no,
I actually I came to do the masters because I lost a friend to the sea, and it was very sad, and I had a very hard time kind of moving on and driving boats and just continuing with life from there. And I joined the master's program actually to understand how people dealt with it, and to just look at the maritime industry in a different lens without the pressure of being in it actively myself. And I I didn't really know what I wanted my master's dissertation to be about. And right before we kind of had those discussions, me and my supervisor, we had a tour of McSweeney's monument. And as those discussions started, my professor kind of knew my background, and he said it might be a really interesting approach for you to take, given what you've been through, that maybe you should discuss this, and maybe you should focus on death at sea and how we memorialize sailors over time. And I ended up thinking it was a really good idea. So that's kind of how it came to be about. And I wanted to give McSweeney and also just to understand this research to the best degree I could. And it became a really beautiful story and a really wonderful piece of work that actually kind of transcended what any of my expectations ever could have thought. So it was both a really beautiful way to kind of commemorate my friend, but also to ignite a passion of maritime history within me that I definitely will carry for a really long time.
Yes. So Brenna, this has been a fascinating episode, an exciting story. You're a gifted storyteller. I give you that. Thank you very much for sharing your research with us. And I hope you continue onto this line of research in the future. I think it's very interesting. I think it's very important, and especially for places for small islands like Malta or other islands,
Absolutely.
but also for coastal cities in larger continents. I think it's all very important, and I think that the way people just basically treated this person as a saint from one point on, I think it's extraordinary. So thank you very much for being on the podcast. Thank you very much for sharing. I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of the M.A.R.E. podcast, and I will see you all next time.